We're going to take a look in this section at the graph of tangent. So I've gone ahead and set up my input-output table. This is my input and this is my output. So that on my x-axis I've gone by pi over 2s. I could have certainly done pi over 4s or anything else, but I went ahead and did pi over 2s. And what we're going to do is look at what happens when we put these things into the tangent function. So if you'll remember, tangent is always our y value over our x value. So let's take a look at, let's just start with 0. So if I'm looking at 0, if I take the y value over the x value, I have 0 divided by 1, which is 0. So at 0, there's a point 0. Let's go to pi over 2. When we get to pi over 2, I have the y value, which is 1, over the x value, which is 0. So this one is 1 divided by 0. And 1 divided by 0 is undefined. That means at this place, pi over 2, we will never see the tangent graph. We talked about that a little bit in Algebra 2. And when you have a place where there's absolutely no graph, you have an asymptote. So let's keep going at pi. So if I move around to pi and do the y value over the x value, I get 0 divided by negative 1. And 0 divided by negative 1 is 0. So at pi, I'm at 0 again. At 3 pi over 2, I get negative 1 over 0, so undefined. So you can see then that anytime I have the 0 in the x spot, I'm going to have undefined. So I'm going to have an asymptote at 3 pi over 2, back around at 5 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2. I'll even have one over here at negative pi over 2. The graph does not go through those places. Anytime that we're at pi, or 2 pi, or 3 pi, or negative pi, we'll always be at 0. So what I need to do is find out what the graph's doing in between these places. So I'm going to look in between 0 and pi over 2. So in between 0 and pi over 2 is this place called pi over 4. And the place pi over 4 is a square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. So at that particular place, tangent is going to be 1 because I have the same x and y value. So at pi over 4, I'm going to be at, let's just call this place 1. If I go to negative pi over 4, that would be here, I would have a positive x value and a negative y value, so that would be negative 1. So what happens is you get a curve that kind of looks like this. And that's going to happen at all of these pi over 4 places. So in between each of these, you're going to have graphs that look something like this. So whenever you think about the domain and the range, the domain here can really be anything except for we have these places where the graph is undefined. So I'm going to say that the domain is all reals except the pi over 2s. Because at every place where it's a pi over 2, we have undefined. The range is going to be negative infinity to infinity because this never stops down here and it keeps going here. The period is a little bit different. The period, the place where I start and stop, so here it went negative pi over 2 to 1 pi over 2, 1 pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2. So in between these spaces is just 1 pi. So the period for tangent is different than the period for sine, cosine, and tangent. Or excuse me, for sine and cosine. Sine and cosine, the period is 2 pi. But for tangent, the period is pi.